I got those finishing tapes put on the wing spars day before yesterday, and then coated everything with polybrush, all the other finishing tapes too, and I had to let that stuff set up. Well, I think my filters in my mask must have been getting old, because I wound up with a heck of a headache after I got finished. Of course, you can't do much in here where that stuff's wet and curing, so I took my dump trailer out to the sand pit and got a load of sand to make my drain field, my mound system for my drain field and my septic. And then yesterday I came out here, took the iron and went over those to heat form everything. And then I come back here on the back, trimmed out the tail end of these rib finish tapes and glued those down into the wing spars, into the false spars. Then I put another coat of polybrush on everything. That'd be the third coat on these rib finishing tapes, but the second coat on these spar tapes. Well, of course, again, because you can't do anything while that stuff is damp, and it takes a while in this cool temperatures here for that to cure up, I quit here for the day and took the trailer out again and got another load of sand for my septic system. But I'd put new filters in my mask, so I felt pretty good yesterday evening. So I come up here after dinner and worked on this a little bit more, took the iron and went over all the finishing tapes again here. Then I started laying out the finishing tapes for the leading edge and the false spars here. Now, the overlay for the fabric here on the false spars on the trailing edge, the requirement is a minimum of 1 inch. Now again, that's the minimum. That's what the book says is the minimum, and you can always do more than the minimum. But anyway, because of the concave shape of this trailing edge, it makes it kind of hard to get everything to stick down to it. So I overlap that by more than 1 inch. There's 2 inches of overlap on that. Say to put a 3-inch finishing tape on there, but when I put the 3-inch tape on there, it just barely covered up that seam. So I've got the 4-inch tape laying there. Same here with the flap false bar. Now the flap false bar, it'll cover up the seam really good. But on the aileron false bar, it not only covers up the seam, but I can turn that and bend that over and get a double over this edge right here. So I like that. Well, anyway, I've got that laid out, and then I've got my leading edge seam tape laid out here too, and that's another 4-inch tape. And I'll run it down the leading edge, and that'll go over the seam on it. And then when it comes down here to the wing tip, of course, it starts tapering down, and it tapers down pretty thin as it comes around the wingtip. So what I've got here is some 4-inch bias tape, and what they do is they cut the tape diagonally across the sheet. Now the sheet of fabric, of course, is 6 feet wide. The grain of the fabric runs parallel back and forth this way and cross 90 degrees this way. Well, for the bias tape, they'll cut it at an angle 45 degrees across the fabric. What that does is it puts the tape here on a bias, and so when you pull on the tape, you can actually shrink the tape down. It'll start out at 4 inches and match up with the 4-inch tape on this end, and then as you pull it around the corner, as this wing gets narrower as it comes around, it'll actually come down to 3 inches or so, whatever you want. So, and it forms around the corner better. I could run 4-inch tape around there, but then you have to heat form it all the way around. And with the bias tape, if you just pull on it, it'll actually form right to the curve without doing any heat forming on it. Well, you can see right here, here's a seam on the bias tape where it's stitched together. So it comes in a roll of various lengths, but you have to cut this seam off right here, so you're just running a continuous length of it. So it's only about 80 inches or so long. Oh, anyway, I've got that laid out, and I like the way that looks. So think what I'm going to do now. I'm going to take this 4-inch tape off the leading edge, and I have to trim up all the finish tapes, all the rib finish tapes there, and get those all glued down. And then I have to work on finishing up around that landing light. And once I get that done, then I can put this finishing tape on the leading edge. So that's the project of the day. I'll get busy and start doing that. And I've got one more coat of polybrush to put on the finishing tapes for the wing spars. Then of course I'll have to put a couple of coats of polybrush on the leading edge and false spar tapes once I get those glued up. Well, anyway, I've been going over this, and as I've gone over it, I found a few little defects that I've made. I was pretty meticulous about going through that wing before I started the cover job and get all the debris and everything out of it. I did have to drill a few holes in it to put new screws in a couple of spots, and I wanted to make sure and get all the shavings and stuff out of there. Well, I didn't get them all out. I wound up finding a couple spots where there was a couple of metal shavings that got in between the fabric and the leading edge here, and they were just little dimples that just stuck up. You could just barely feel them, but they were there. So I took a razor and just made a little slit there where that thing stood up, and then took a little probe and fished out the shaving out of there, filled the hole back in, or pushed the fabric back in the hole to fill it back up, and then just cut a little patch to go over the hole there. I've got two of those, one here right by where the wing struts attach, and another one here just outboard of the fuel tank, outboard fuel tank rib. Otherwise it all wound up pretty good, I think. Pretty clean. I didn't do as good a job as I should have on planning where to terminate these finishing tapes for these ribs as they were hanging over the leading edge. Now on the top side, when I did the top, I had a definite line there, the seam line that I cut those off at. They recommend, or they don't recommend, they say in the book to run those down and meet them up together, or you can run a continuous tape all the way around. Someplace, it's not in the polyfiber book, it might be in the AC 4313, but they recommended taking and putting little slits in those finishing tapes every so far in case they tear loose, come loose for some reason. They'll tear there instead of tearing the whole finishing tape off and possibly tearing a whole patch of fabric off. The polyfiber book doesn't say anything about doing that, but they do say to go down there and meet those finishing tapes up together on the leading edge. I did that on the trailing edge, but what I'm going to do here on the leading edge is I'm going to cut those finishing tapes off right where the seam, that top fabric comes over and lays against the leading edge skin. And there's a line right there. I'm going to terminate those finishing tapes right there on that line. So anyway, I hadn't planned that out very well when I was putting these finishing tapes on, and I went over those leading edges with several coats of polybrush and wound up gluing those tapes down past where I wanted to terminate them. So I did the same thing with these as what I did down there on that finishing tape on the butt rib. I just took a rag with some MEK on it and wiped it on each of those back to where I wanted them to come back to trim them, and then I come back and held the rag over the tape until it softened up the underlying polybrush, and then just peeled those back a little bit. Open the door so I can let the MEK fumes out, but MEK is the ultimate solvent for this stuff. Oh, I'm not trying to wash any of the polybrush off or anything like that. All I was doing was just setting it on there long enough to loosen it up so I could pull those tapes back. Now I can go along there and cut all those tapes, trim them off to my final size. They're going to match up right there to where that edge is on that fabric underneath. You trim those up right there, and then that end should disappear when the finish tape goes over the front. The leading edge tape goes over the front. All of that should disappear. Wait here a few minutes here and make sure all of that MEK evaporates before I do anything else, because that did soften up the polybrush, and the polybrush in those tapes is going to make it easier to cut those off nice and smooth without any fraying on the end of it or anything. So I'm going to go over there on the other side of the wing now and look at that, but I think it's ready to go. I think I'm ready to start gluing that finishing tape on the other side. Now, the Polybrush manual tells you to make your lines and then snap a blue chalk line where you want them, so you have a continuous blue chalk line. My chalk line that I have up here is a red chalk line, and I did all this in red chalk, which I got chalk all over my clothes and everything else as I was doing it, but that kind of disappears into the background of this pink tape. Well, I don't have a blue chalk line up here, but right now I'm drawing my lines out on that false bar, and I just went ahead and I just got a carpenter's pencil here. I guess I could use I got a general general pencil here, a small one that I've been using to make all my lines and stuff, or marks with, I'll just go ahead and take a straight edge. I've marked where I want that tape to go on the false bar for the flap, and I'll go ahead and get a straight edge and just mark that along there, and then we'll glue it up. Now I got to mix up some polybrush. I'll get that mixed up, and then I'll put that tape on the flap false bar. Then I'll lay out for the tape onto the aileron false bar and get it put on. Now that was a little tougher to do than the 2-inch finishing tapes. That 4-inch finishing tape, trying to get it lined up. You know, it's softer material. This is, I think, the lightweight material and not the medium weight like the fabric of the wing is. The 2-inch tapes weren't too bad. You could take those and lay them on there and kind of maneuver them around a little bit. But that 4-inch tape is a whole lot different. And this is just a short section of it here, trying to keep it lined up and then trying to keep it flat. Well, we got spaces right here where you get little holidays or little bubbles in it. And you want to try to push those down and get them to flatten out. But that's a mistake, because when you do, you wind up pushing the poly brush out from underneath those. So when you come back later with the iron to try to iron them down, then there's no poly brush underneath them to stick it down with. I learned that the hard way. It took me a while to figure that out, but now I got that figured out. I'm not doing that anymore. I'm not trying to force those to stick down. We'll come back around them when everything cures and dries out with the iron, and then they'll iron in and they'll flatten right out. But if you try to push them out now, then you get a void underneath there, a void of poly brush, then there's nothing under there for them to stick to. And it looks like I've got a bristle off my brush right there. I want to see if I can get that out of there, but sometimes when those go in there, that's underneath the tape. And when that happens, then you're just screwed. I didn't overlap the skins, the upper and lower skins, on this aileron false bar as much as I did on the flaps false bar. A 3-inch tape would probably cover that, but if I put the 4-inch tape on there, the tape is going to go down and it's going to wrap around that edge, that top edge, which is a good thing. I've got at least a 2-inch overlap between the top fabric and the bottom fabric. The top fabric, of course, went on first, and it went right up, I guess it'd be the top edge of those aileron hinges. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and put this finishing tape right there to that top edge of those aileron hinges. It'll go over the seam, which is the main exposed seam, is one where the bottom fabric comes down over the top fabric near the top of aileron false rib, and then it's going to wrap over the top of that edge. So that should be good enough, and if not, I'll swear it should have been. That's good. The finishing tape is on the false bars. Now the one on the aileron false bar, once that poly brush sets up on it, I'll take the iron and form that around that top edge, and then when I flip the wing over, we'll glue it down to that top edge of that. And I like that. That top of the wing takes a lot of abuse there, and rain and snow and stuff like that slides down over that edge. So that's good to have that doubled up. I'll go ahead and readjust this wing now and go over to the other side, the leading edge, and start trimming up those tapes over there. MEK should be evaporated enough now out of those that I can trim those up pretty good. Well, I got the finish tape on the rear false bar. To finish it, I'm going to need to turn it over, iron it out, and glue it down to the top fabric. I got all of these finish tapes for the ribs trimmed off, and the ones for the spars trimmed off. And I just got done trimming out the landing light assembly there. I've got clamps on it holding it in so the poly brush sets up right on it. I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mix up a little bit more poly brush, enough to go over those spar tapes again, the finish tapes on the main spar and a couple other spots around there. And then I'm going to go let that stuff set up before I make a line. I got to make a mark where my edge of my finish tape is going to go. I think I'll go ahead and mix up some polybrush, put my next coat of polybrush on those spar tapes, and then I'm going to go out and get a load of sand. Let this stuff all dry out. The day before yesterday I put that finishing tape on that rear spar and then added some more polybrush to the rest of those tapes and stuff on there. Came up yesterday and did my heat deal with the rear spar, cleaning it up with the iron and stuff, make sure all the edges were down and everything, and then went over the rest of this the same way. And then I went in and started trimming things up. I worked on that landing light opening there and got the fabric tucked in and around it and everything, got it shaped up pretty good. Then I wound up putting a second coat of polybrush on that finishing tape on the false spar. Well, then I had to leave everything while it all cured up, so I went out and got a couple of loads of sand out of the sand pit. Well, last night I came up here and cleaned that up again, went over the rear with the iron again, kind of smoothing it out, and it didn't really need a whole lot. Well, then I laid out this finishing tape for the front, got it put on. So I've got it run from the butt rib out to the landing light, and then from the landing light out to the outboard aileron rib. And then we've got to do something from there on out to transition as it goes around that wingtip bow. And now it does a couple of things as it goes down around that wingtip bow. The wing tapers down, and then of course it also goes around the corner. So there's a couple different ways I could do that, and one is I could go ahead and run that 4-inch tape all the way around there and then heat form that tape around that wingtip bow. Well, that takes a lot of work. So my other option on that is to take this 4-inch bias tape. As I've explained before, this tape is cut on a bias, so as you pull on it, it shrinks and it'll also form a curve. So that's what I'm going to do. Now there's different ways you can put that on there too. One is I could just go ahead and make a straight line on both of them and butt them up together where they meet to go around the corner. Two, I could use the pinking shears and pink the edges together and then butt them up together and run them around. Or the third option, and the one that I like, is I can go ahead and take the pinking shears and cut a scallop, or not a scallop, but a curve, make this curved, and then make this curved, and overlap the two of them. And then when you get done, you either wind up with a circle or an oval right there where the two of them meet. And that's what I'm going to do. And there's a couple of options on what to do there too. I've seen the guys do it two different ways. And one, I can go ahead and bring this finish tape out, glue it on there like that, and then take the 4-inch tape, put over the top of that and run it around there. Or what I like better is I'm going to go ahead and glue the bias tape on there onto the leading edge, and then put the leading edge tape over the top of that so it overlaps the tape that goes around the corner. And I've put a little bit of, well, it's just my sluice box there. I've got the container, the bucket where I put all of my brushes in with MEK in it, that winds up getting a lot of polybrush and polytack and stuff like that in there that get dissolved in the MEK. So it winds up being a thin solution of the polytack, polybrush. So what I'm going to do here is cut this off. And I maybe want that to go out to about there. The taper starts here, but it doesn't really get pronounced until it gets to this short rib right here. So if I cut that off there, like that, and I can fold this over. See, that makes a nice rounded shape right there. And if I do the same thing with this one, I've got the edge of my seam on my bias tape right there. So that's just about as far as I could run that tape. and I'll just run it. Do the same thing on it. Now when I put my tapes together like that, that'll either look round, depending on how far I stick that in there, it'll be a nice round, or I can stick it in farther and make it an oval, and I kind of like the oval shape there. Anyway, I think that looks more finished than doing it the other way. So then I got to mark the center line of this tape, and it just goes around here, and as it goes around we'll pull on it just a little bit at a time, and it just gradually gets smaller and smaller and just goes right around that curve. This tape, I'm going to run it out here so it's nice and straight and make my mark where the top of the tape is. And I can take this tape and just glue it on right there so the top of that matches up with a 4-inch tape, like straight tape. Now I need to go along this tape and mark the center line of it so I can run the center line on this leading edge right here. So that's going to take me a few minutes. Alright, I've got the two tapes glued up together here. Get this to come up just a little bit more so it matches up just a little bit better. This comes around, starts coming around the corner right here, so there's some bunching up of this main 4-inch tape right there. That should come out with the iron. Well, now what I'll do is I've got my bias tape lined up with a center line on it. I'll just go ahead and run a little bit of poly brush on the center line of this wingtip bow as it goes around, and then just start pulling that thing around there. Actually, I should use my little teeny brush for this so I can keep control of it. Alright, I think that works. I'm going to go ahead and let that set up and then come in and we'll go around this edge on this top edge here and glue that all down, and then I'll have to flip the wing over and do the other side. A lot of times what you're doing is you're coming from a 4-inch tape around and tapering down to meet into a 3-inch tape. Then you have to really watch how you pull that tape out there, but I'm not doing that. We're terminating right on the end of that aileron rib, that outboard aileron rib. It's not meeting into another tape there, so I don't have to match the size up as it comes around there. And besides, I used a 4-inch tape on that rear spar, false spar anyway. Well, I've got a little trim out work to do on that butt rib. Then I think I'll put another coat of polybrush on this leading edge tape, and then I think I'll go get a couple loads of sand, or a load of sand, and I'll come back later and finish out this wingtip bow and this end of this leading edge tape.